Can you hear me? Okay.
Hello?
Do you want to do it?
Hello, hello? Testing 1, 2, 1, 3, 4. Testing. Hello?
Got a green light, so that's good.
Hello? Green light.
Just there's a little delay.
Oh, okay, I see. Oh, you can hear it on the computer? Hello, hello? All good? All right, awesome. Thank you so much.
If you don't mind.
Of course,
You
yes.
can do an abridged version, but
Okay.
Julianne did a great introduction. Do you want to do any
Yes.
more introduction, Julianne? You
I
got
can
it.
reintroduce.
Okay, great.
Yes, no problem. Again, another thank you all for taking time to be here this evening and to listen in. This topic is something that is really helpful and important, and you all are central to. We know what effective prevention is, and that involves all of the trusted adults, all of the attitudes, policies, and practices that come together to support health. The parents are a huge part of that, caregivers as well. So thank you for your time and attention. And for those in person, you're welcome to ask questions at any time. My name's Caitlin Smith, and I am coming to you from the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. It is one of the largest addiction treatment organizations in the U.S., and they have recently brought us on as their Prevention Solutions Division. We were formerly known as FCD, Prevention Works. That may sound familiar, may not to anyone. But we have been doing what we do for over 45 years. It started really simply with just one man who realized with his experience in recovery that most other people in recovery had started using alcohol and other drugs very young. So he took that information, talked to local schools in Massachusetts, and today we've grown quite a bit. We have a number of specialists all over the country who talk to students around the world and all over the country about health. And we couple our stories really with evidence-based skill building strategies and health-based information, and really just creating an open space to talk about alcohol and other drug use, something that students, children might not be able to talk about all of the time. And another component, we have created a student attitudes and behavior survey, which is a tool to assess substance use in certain communities. You'll be seeing some data from those surveys later. And when we're thinking about prevention, it's got three kind of primary components, and these can happen across the lifetime. Prevention starts as early as birth with proper care, and later in lower school or elementary school, thinking about healthy choices, healthy decision-making, spaces to ask questions related to health and supporting students there. And then moving upward and onward, thinking about prevention of addiction as dispelling inaccurate health-based information, or having students talk through their perceptions on these topics, filling in gaps where they need them. So an example here of these three factors, these three things that comprise prevention: identifying and strengthening protective factors. Students in this community have a number of them. They're very evident. If we think about one specific example, having a positive self-concept or self-esteem would be a protective factor against substance use. Risk factors, those things that may or may not can be changed, something like a genetic predisposition, that's something we can't change necessarily, but we can address and bring attention to. A risk factor for substance use is having a negative self-concept, low self-esteem, and identifying and intervening on behaviors that could potentially lead to disease. So if we're using that self-esteem example again, that might look like intervening on negative self-talk, providing opportunities for self-esteem engagement, like extracurriculars, things like that. The way we approach this topic is from a health perspective. So we're talking to students about healthy or less healthy or unhealthy choices. We look at addiction as a neurological brain disease, one that is chronic and progressive and develops over time, that like other chronic diseases like cancer or diabetes has environmental and genetic factors. The genetic component, it's not like a gene that can be passed down, but rather how our genetics influence the way we experience both craving and tolerance when it comes to substance use. And I ask students to ask, if they don't already know, which many of them do, if they have a family history of addiction. It's great information for them to gather for themselves so that they can make the most informed decisions as possible. And if we're thinking about how that could be potentially frightening or scary for a student, we can think about it as like when we know our risk, we can create protection. If I know I have a risk, genetic risk for skin cancer, I can wear sunscreen and wear a hat and things of that nature. Surroundings, a large part of our programming is discussing family norms. What's peer norms? What are norms in your peer group? How peers influence one another? Media, not only what you're consuming in the media, but how you are consuming it. And school culture, policies, procedures, rules at home, all of these things come together to create a picture of a student and really what their risk and protections are. And the last component, potentially the most influential one, is thinking about age of first use. So we know the younger someone is when they introduce an addictive substance into their brain and their body, the more likely they are to become addicted and to experience negative health consequences. So we advocate for delayed use, whether that's delaying use by 1 year or 2, or until they're of legal age of consumption, or until their brain is fully developed. That's a decision they make with themselves, their families, and their communities. But advocating knowing delayed use is protective is a big part of our program. Now, you might be thinking, like, how could I identify a risk factor in a child? These are some tangible things we could look for. We know that can be risky for children if they have a lack of social or coping skills. That might be not knowing how to manage big feelings. That might be not knowing how to handle conflict, how to engage with others, how to ask for help. These are all examples of social and coping skills that keep children healthy. Having mixed messages around alcohol and other drug use. This is okay. I hear this from my mom. I hear this from my teachers. I'm not really sure where the truth is. Affiliations with peers with unhealthy risk-taking behaviors, again, that role of peer influence, and having perceived approval of drug-using behaviors or accessibility to those things. Protective factors, which there's an expansive list for lower, middle, and upper school students specifically that I've condensed just a little bit here, but I'm happy to share them all. These are some things that keep your children healthy, things I've seen this week being practiced in your community. Having clear expectations on what is expected of me from my family, what's expected of me from my school. And having values behind those expectations. That's key there too. Those values can help shape behavior and guide choices even under pressure. Limits, monitoring structure, opportunities for engagement. There's so many of those here at Louisville Collegiate. Presence of mentors. I've seen so many warm faculty interactions with students this week. It was wonderful. Healthy coping, problem-solving skills, ability to control emotions. These are things that are protective. I included this briefly to talk about social media, though certainly not a comprehensive discussion, but the way social media could potentially put someone at a higher risk of substance use or protect them from it. There's an organization called Common Sense Media. They're found at commonsensemedia.org. They have so many great resources when it comes to social media, age-appropriate rules and regulations, practices. They have a practice social media game where if you're considering with your child if they should be able to have it or not, they can practice different difficult situations before they might actually encounter them. But this is some research we have, knowing that things like low self-esteem from social comparing or an unrealistic perspective, this fear of missing out on things, or gathering misinformation, these things could potentially be risk factors for students, as well as sleep disruption, super vital to the teenage brain for its development, especially in this prefrontal cortex. And if that cortex isn't working properly, their decision-making can be impaired. Social media protections. There is actually to this space where students are connected to health-based information. When students shared with me this week all the prevention messages they've seen, the majority of them are on social media. And they are able to circulate and see that information they might not come in contact with. They also might be able to engage with a community who is not in their immediate proximity. So having that connection, very healthy, as well as a space to explore who they are, what they like. This can be a very healthy tool for children. We absolutely do talk about technology addiction in class, and other behavior addiction, what that can look like. We discuss the difference between a habit and an addiction. Addiction being defined by its negative consequences with the repeated action, right? Whether it's our social, emotional, physical, or whatever type of health. So many students have been open this week about taking social media breaks, what that looked like for them, how that changed their behavior, and how it increased their awareness, even if they're back on now. But social media and technology is something to, if you're worried about that or being conscious of it in your home, it's something to have limits and structure around. Moderation, having access to the content that they're looking at or creating. It's an additional space where we can essentially monitor children. So thinking about the teenage brain, specifically how it's developing, y'all may already know, but the way that addiction happens in the brain has to do with dopamine. It's this pleasure reward chemical that's released when we're doing things that are helpful for our survival and our well-being. When it's released, our brain creates this motivation to do this thing again. It's like a neural pathway. Unfortunately, what all addictive drugs have in common is they cause this unnatural release of dopamine. That's the reason people use drugs recreationally, to change the way that they're feeling. And for teenagers who have higher levels of dopamine, thrills like that, thrills are more thrilling and rewards are more rewarding. So for that reason, the teen brain is more susceptible to creating that motivation, acquiring that addiction, essentially. That and the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, very much is still developing for teenagers, which is really integral to something called executive functioning, which is like being able to practice self-control, have working memory, have flexible thinking. So when someone introduces an addictive substance to their brain, the prefrontal cortex connections are distorted. They don't develop in the same way, they don't happen. That's why I tell students, as someone in long-term healthy recovery, have made changes to my prefrontal cortex that I can't fully undo. I can build in healthy habits, but it's the reason that this is a chronic disease. So with that being said, it's simply the reason we advocate for delayed use. We know that the younger someone is when they use, they could potentially have health effects, negative health effects. Another corner piece to our approach with students is the social norms approach, which is evidence-based, and it certainly takes time to implement, but it is essentially what it tells us is that we as people tend to hyperfixate and exaggerate the unhealthy behavior of our peers. It's kind of actually our brain's survival mechanism to pay lots of attention to like scandalous information, and that also applies to alcohol and other drug use. So we as adults and as children might think more of our peers are using than they actually are. And if we can create more realistic norms around substance use, we can potentially promote healthier behavior for students. So what that's looked like this week is gauging student perceptions. What percentage of your school do you think is using this substance? Or what percentage nationally is your school representative of that? Looking at our perceptions, and then I'm presenting them with some data, which I'll discuss in a little bit from an organization called Monitoring the Future, and exploring it. Like if we have a skewed perception, where does it come from? What messages are we getting? Is a certain group of students louder than the other? Does one have more social power? And does that change how we're thinking? So what research tells us is that the majority of children, of teenagers, are making healthy choices around alcohol and other drugs, which is great news. We just have to spread the word in a sense. So Monitoring the Future is an organization out of the University of Michigan, and they have been distributing anonymous surveys in the US to both public and private school students since the 1970s. And with that, we've been able to track different substance trends as they've been happening. The happy news again from 2021 is that across the many different substances they survey for, there were notable statistically significant decreases in substance use. These are lots of numbers. I've bolded some of the ones here that stood out. These are, by the way, the 3 most used substances amongst young people. And we can see 10th graders in the past year used at a rate of 40.7% in 2020 of alcohol, and that came down to 28.5%. 8th grade marijuana use came into the single digits for the first time in a while in 2021. So we are absolutely exploring the potential reasons for this, right? We've all had these shift in norms because of the pandemic, and some of this information, these results are likely from that, right? Whether it's reduced accessibility or increased parental monitoring or reduced social pressure, probably a combination of the things. We certainly are paying attention to how this might be affecting children. And actually, this is the first time Monitoring the Future has asked for what they call mental health symptoms report. And these are just the averages for 8th, 10th, and 12th grade students combined. And you can see that on average, these students had an increase, not a lot, but an increase in these mental health symptoms like feeling depressed or bored or sad, or feeling disinterested, having trouble concentrating. This is important information to us as well, because we know that there is a link between mental health and substance use. Students, children living with mental illness are at a higher risk of also engaging with alcohol and other drugs. So when we are screening for mental health symptoms, we are potentially also preventing substance use at the same time. And with proper, with a treatment plan or proper treatment of mental illness, this risk is reduced. So that would be the goal, to identify early and start to treat in some shape or fashion. Speaking just a little bit more to current trends, and then moving into what you all can do specifically as caregivers. This is a chart from Monitoring the Future on binge drinking and how it has been changing. Drinking and binge drinking started going down in 1984 with the passage of the Minimum Drinking Age Act, changing the legal drinking age to 21. But you can see over in the far right, the 2021 numbers were much lower than 2020, which is happy news. This is a higher risk drinking behavior. Binge drinking is defined by 4 drinks in one sitting for someone assigned female at birth, and 5 drinks in one sitting for someone assigned male at birth. And when a young person is drinking like that, they're likely well into the stages of intoxication, increases their risk for addiction or to have some kind of consequence. This is the graph you're seeing on the right-hand side. This is from our Student Attitudes and Behavior Survey, and we are able to distribute that to communities all over the world. And we have about 30 or 40 countries in the database now, and some of them have drinking ages that are less than 21 years old. So consistently in those countries, we find that students report more binge drinking, this higher risk drinking behavior, getting drunk in the past 30 days, thinking it's socially rewarding to do so, and also having alcohol-related injury. So these are things we certainly want to avoid for children. They also speak to delayed use. Like, has anyone ever heard about or thought about like a European model of drinking, where I teach them how at a young age? All the research we have, ours included, tells us that potentially exposes a student to those negative health consequences and addiction. Unfortunately, while the teenage brain can learn so aptly at this time, alcohol and other drug use doesn't work that way, and actually distorts the development of their prefrontal cortex, where they need it to be functioning to make healthy choices. Also, when students are permitted to drink with their family, research tells us when they're drinking with a peer group, they're going to do it in a much different way. There's different expectations, different norms in each group, and even though perhaps it was done responsibly at home, that doesn't necessarily translate to outside the home. A little bit of current trends with e-cigarettes. A sense that I'm getting this week, and I've gotten it from other communities recently as well, which is great news, is that vaping is almost going out of fashion, or it's not on trend anymore. So while there are, as you can see, millions of children and students who are using these devices and likely addicted to high milligram doses of nicotine, there is information out there about the dangers of vaping. There is prevention messages that are circulating, and children are having personal experiences, either themselves or with friends, that let them know this is not something I want to do. This could jeopardize my health, and there are real consequences to e-cigarette use. But this information is from a 2021 youth tobacco survey from the CDC and the FDA. And you can see that the vast majority of children who use these devices still use flavored ones, which there was a federal flavor ban that went into effect 2020, but it only applied to certain products. So with that, youth interest has shifted to a different type of product. And some of these products are available with concentrations of nicotine that are as high as like 2 packs, 2.5 packs, 3 packs of cigarettes in a single cartridge or pod. So that is a lot of nicotine to be introduced into the brain. And I have had conversations with students about cessation and what that looks like, what the options are. for cessation. This is just a little history of e-cigarette. E-cigarettes, they started, of course, as this means to be a healthier, quote unquote, alternative to combustible tobacco cigarettes. Now, with the short-term research we have, we know that that's not turning out to be true, but that was their intention and purpose. And these USB devices, I'm going to skip past that because I'm not sure how it will translate, but feel free to watch that on your own. It shows the shapes of different devices that are available, how they can look like everyday products, highlighters, pens, things that when you are monitoring as a parent or checking on your students, things you can potentially look for. But right now, this top left-hand corner here, the puff bar, that's reportedly the most popular choice of current e-cigarette users, both high school and middle school in the US. It is a fully disposable product, available still in many different flavors. And I recently attended a youth tobacco conference where kids were discussing how these products were impacting their environment, which I thought was really powerful and a great way to approach this, because maybe students aren't thinking so much about their immediate health, but some students really care about what's happening with the planet. So another place you could potentially insert a prevention conversation. These bottom left-hand products here, these are, they do not have nicotine in them. They are e-cigarette devices. Instead, they have things like melatonin or B12, other supplements. I haven't had students talking about these here, but I get more and more questions about, well, is a vape without nicotine okay? And the simple answer to that is no, those products are not designed to go into your lungs. And also are highly unregulated. So we don't know what other potential chemicals we could be introducing into our brains, our bodies, and our lungs at that time. The top right-hand corner, it's called an IQOS. It's a cigarette heating device, so the cigarette does not burn. The idea behind it was less carcinogens ingested, but that is something that has not come up here, again, not to alarm anyone, but something to be mindful of, all the products that are available. The bottom right-hand corner, these are similar to chew tobacco, but they are fully salt nicotine pouches. Salt nicotine is a type of nicotine developed by the vaping industry that is less harsh on the throat. So it was developed for that reason. And it's placed in these pouches and available in a variety of milligram dosages of nicotine. All right, so last bit about current trends. Thinking about marijuana, there has been this kind of global, actually, decrease in perception of harm around marijuana and what it can do to the brain and the body. And that's coupled with this increase in THC potency. So THC is the psychoactive chemical compound in the marijuana plant, the one that does lead to addiction. In the 1970s, based on the plants they were cultivating at the time, an average marijuana cigarette or joint would have had about 4% THC. Today, that would look more like 20 to 30% THC. And there are products available with a much higher concentration. So when we talk about legalization and medical marijuana and how can it be that bad if it's acceptable in these variety of forms, I really talk about THC and the brain and how it is still risky for a young growing adult, young adult brain. Just a little bit too about CBD. Have y'all seen the rise of CBD stores the same way I have in Atlanta? Yes, okay. They're certainly out there now, and CBD cannabidiol is an essential component of medical marijuana. It's used to treat seizure disorders, but it now is available in all these different forms, patches, lotions, supplements, etc. There's no high, so it's not psychoactive. It doesn't produce that dopamine spike like THC. But the research around CBD and what it could potentially do for pain relief or cravings for other addictions or nausea or anxiety, this research is highly anecdotal, like it's very new, and it's not fully developed. So with that being said, like we don't know what a therapeutic dose of CBD would look like. We don't know if there are long-term effects, especially for a growing brain. So it's something to help fill in those gaps of education for students. If they see something becoming widely available and acceptable, they still can have this information to carry with them if they're thinking about CBD. Okay, so coming into what we can do as adults in children's lives, these are some potential signs of a developing substance use disorder or substance misuse in general. Potentially, these are also signs of mental health disorder developing. But these things, mood swings, agitation, change in friend groups, change in appearance, change in attitude or personality or priority. These are things too that can be just a teenager being a teenager. And that can be the difficult part. But the message here is it's never too early or silly to have a conversation to check in when we see one of those changes. An example from my life, I was a dancer my whole life, and around my 10th grade year, I was like, yeah, I'm not gonna dance anymore. And my parents, we had lots of trust, they respected my choice. But maybe had they asked, like, where's your time and energy going? Is there a reason this is less appealing to you? Etc. We could have gotten into a conversation about where my time and energy was going, which was more to parties than anything else. Of course, they did wonderfully and are wonderful people, but just an example of how that could look. But if you do potentially identify a sign and symptom, you have a conversation, you realize you might need more help and structure or support than you can provide, having a plan set beforehand of where you might go, what doctor or care provider or psychologist would you see, having this set beforehand can be really helpful because when we're upset or stressed, we don't think the same way. So if we have this plan established, and from that point, from their recommendation, creating a plan with the child in mind, and being, again, kind of the prefrontal cortex that children need. We are there to monitor, to limit, and to provide any kind of additional support. And also having resources readily available. There's a number of really cool like texting apps I've heard about from students this week. If someone's trying to quit using nicotine, it will text them every day, check in, see how they're doing, and all kinds of peer support groups. Hazelden Betty Ford actually, during the pandemic, has developed a free online group for both children who are experiencing addiction and family members of children who are experiencing addiction as a resource that I will share the information for. But having those things available, places you know you trust or could go to before it happens, could be helpful. This is just some language, if you need it, to how to approach your child. If you suspect something is happening or you've noticed one of these changes, small or big, it's probably an idea to seek support for yourself first, right? Taking even just a deep breath, taking time to process your feelings before we come in, and convey your affection, tell them why you're coming to them. They know that you care about them immensely, but sometimes they need that reminder. Expressing your concern, telling them exactly like a detail or a piece of what you have noticed, and offering your help. These are things I can do to support you, to keep you accountable. I can be here to talk. Is there extra stress on your plate? Just having that exploratory conversation, being prepared to actively listen to what they are saying. And after that, having again those limits, those expectations for you and for your child as well. These I share with you, these are reasons we commonly hear from students as to why, even with all the health-based information education they have, why do teens choose to use? Stress being probably the one I hear most. Also having fun, to fit in, it's socially rewarding, to build confidence, to escape a negative emotion. I share these so that y'all know these are places where we can help build in protections and healthy alternatives, right? What is a healthy way to cope with stress? What is a healthy way to take a risk and explore curiosity? Learning a new language, talking to someone new, trying out for a sport are very risk-taking, satisfying behaviors. So these are places where we can build in healthy alternatives. And this is available to you if you need it. If not, all good. But this can be a tool to help structure or create or outline the norms in your family. And it moves from values, family beliefs and values, to rules and expectations based on those values, to the consequences if those are not lived up to. And the last portion being numbers, people we can call if we're under stress, or websites or sources of information we trust as a family, places you know you can go for further information. This is again, just a tool that if you find it helpful, you can use or even just use to think about these conversations. But what we know, there's this saying we have, and it's not one 60-minute conversation, but rather 61-minute conversations that are effective prevention, health-based conversations. And that is just catching these moments, right? You probably have moments every day with your children. You drive past the CBD store, or you see something in a show that you're both watching, or a news story is being played on the radio, or you're experiencing a lot of stress yourself. Whatever these moments can be, it can be you having a glass of wine at dinner. Hey, this is why this is okay for my body. This is why it's not okay for your brain and your body. Just a reminder, you know I love you. This is what I expect of you. These are the small moments where we can normalize these conversations, because that's my goal this week, is that students continue the conversation with you, with their peers, with other trusted adults, so that there's less stigma and more questions so they can get health-based answers. Modeling healthy attitudes and behaviors, that's everything from what we do when we're upset to how we interact with others, to like when I'm upset or when I'm stressed, is my go-to like, oh, I need a drink tonight. Just that language, not to be judgmental of it, just something to consider, because those do set norms for children. I've had very, very young students communicate their family's norms with me. Well, if you were going to give me wine or beer, you'd need to give me wine because I'm a woman and my mom drinks wine, not beer. Like it was a whole conversation with a second grader who had so much information already that she had just absorbed. But anyway, in any regard, communicating too with the school or friends, families, coaches regularly, this potentially it could be a source of discomfort. I know when I was a teenager, I made my parents feel really silly for having to reach out to someone to make sure I was actually there. But that's very protective to check in. Hey, I don't know you. I'm so-and-so's mom. Just want to see what they're doing tonight, what time they'll be home. And just so you know, my child is not permitted to drink. I expect the same. Whatever it might be, having those conversations regularly, check-ins, can be very protective. and knowing somewhat some of what is going on in the classroom on the weekends when stress is high, what's trending, having those that information available to you, or seeking it out, doing some research, talking it over with others as well, other parents, other faculty. These are just some examples of setting boundaries and clear expectations, because I know I've said that a lot, but research tells us boundaries and expectations are one of the cornerstones. They're one of the things that keep children healthy. So these are just some examples of those. Having a curfew, making it easy to leave a party. Not necessarily a boundary or an expectation, but something you can implement. What do you text? What do you say? We also call that coping ahead. Who do you call if your car breaks down? Who do you call if you are uncomfortable? These are just small tools we can build in. And these are tips from childmind.org, which is the largest children's mental health organization in the US. They have great resources online. This is just a snippet of what they have, but these are tips for communicating with teens, thinking about validating emotions rather than trying to solve their problem, but rather validating their struggle and helping them talk through potential solutions. This practicing of trust. So I allow this privilege, and when we do that, potentially students, or research tells us, children try to rise to that occasion. Giving them the why behind the consequence, celebrating healthy behaviors whenever we see them, every time. I noticed you got an extra hour of sleep last night. You seemed really frustrated this morning. You did not yell. Great job. That was very healthy. Hitting pause for ourselves when we are upset. It's completely acceptable to say, this is bringing up emotions in me. I'm going to have to come back to this discussion we're having. And doing things together. Research tells us that it helps with communication. Sometimes there's a third thing, an activity, along with the conversation that can help it flow. Now, these are some questions. They're actually from a teacher called Evolved Teacher on Instagram, but they are simple conversation starters, check-in questions that are preventative against substance use. While they seem very basic, they are health-based check-ins. So thinking about these emotion and internal thoughts-based questions, what made you laugh? Who are you worried about? And these environment-based questions, if we switched places and you were the parent, what would you say to me? I think that I haven't heard feedback on that one. I'd love to hear how that works. But these are just for you if you need them. And again, research tells us that students who perceive that their parents disapprove of their own substance use and whose parents know what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, these are children who are less likely to engage with alcohol and other drugs. So these are some of the resources aforementioned. I'll also share the prevention planning document and anything else you might need. And at this time, I would be happy to hear any questions or comments or places you need support. Yes, please.
So there's a lot of television shows that, for example, on HBO, there's a series called Euphoria.
I'm very familiar with from discussion.
I'm not crazy enough to think that if I say I forbid you from watching Euphoria, that my child is going to be confined, and I'm not living in, that land. They're real, so part of me feels as though should. I try to watch it just so I can then have what you said, that 61-minute conversation. I was kind of bored out of my mind. But I do need to know what my child is watching, but is that, what I'm asking, watching a show like Euphoria spark that curiosity where they want to try something like, a substance?
So there is research that tells us when children are exposed to drug activity in media, it can increase their risk of first-time use. There was a study done in, I think it was in Glasgow, but it had to do with Instagram followers, and even the followers who the children were not close with, who were just acquaintances, if more of them were vaping actively on Instagram, those children in 3 years had higher rates of vaping as well. So there is this aspect of exposure. But I think what is most important there is the conversation piece. After your child or whenever they're watching Euphoria, okay, what did it look like today? What was Rue doing? Do you think that was a realistic perspective? Does it make you curious? Do you have questions about that drug? Is there something we can look up together? And those are we've had those Euphoria conversations this week, right? There was a big debate. Does this glorify drug use, or is this presenting the negative consequences? And people were in both parties, but to keep talking about it, and to talk about why drug use could potentially be central to any show, even if it's not about drug use. It's there because we have that that propensity to fixate on those things. We love scandal, right? It's there to get ratings. So we're thinking about these industries and why they're producing the content they are, how they want to create consumers to fuel their industry. So I think, yes, maybe if you told your child you're not watching this, I know I continued to watch things late at night I was not supposed to, but keeping that conversation open about how it's affecting them, what they think about it is important. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, yes.
You had a couple slides that had a whole lot of different
I'll leave it on this one.
devices.
Yes.
Where are they getting all that? Do they walk into Kroger? Where is it being purchased?
Yes, that's a great question. Was it the e-cigarettes you're referring to?
Yeah, or the peppermint, whatever. I mean,
Yeah. Some of those are available in retail locations. Now, the legal age of purchase for those items is 21 years old. So what I hear is that there is a fair amount of online traffic, potential sources there where people are purchasing illegally online, potentially over social media as well. But we do know, research tells us, the place that students use a drug for the first time is usually their friend's house. And it's like a friend of a friend of a friend situation, how they acquired that substance. So, yes, those, or siblings. Yes, very true. Like, which one wouldn't card you, essentially? And there are specialty vaping shops, there are gas stations, there are online realtors that sell these products. Yes.
Taylor, can you, the one slide when you showed us about, and you talked about delaying use, and you're kind of making a point, around the globe, some of the other, countries that you look at.
Yes.
Research and what it tells us about that delayed use.
Can get to
I
it.
assume that maybe it's more of a comment than a question, but I assume that then we can extrapolate that same sort of idea to sometimes the argument that you sometimes hear in high school, which is, well, they're going to go off to college, and so I want to make sure that they're ready to go to college because we know they're going to be around alcohol. So you're sort of justifying the use, maybe in the parent home or whatever the case might be. And I just wanted to, if you could maybe speak to that specifically, because that's something that sometimes gets used as a rationalization for permissive use.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Exposing teenage brains to alcohol does not does not help better prepare that child for like lower risk drinking in the future. It actually promotes higher risk drinking in the future and potential addiction. It simply has to do with that brain development we talked about and the way the teenage brain works. So while that idea is completely well intended and understandable because the teenage brain does learn so quickly, addictive substances distort those prefrontal cortex connections they need to later make those lower risk choices or informed decisions. So, yeah, of course.
So my question is about the delay, question there in the slide that he was just asking about. Is there like a goalpost that is there like a research age, like, okay, if I can just get my kids to 16 before they've had their first exploration with substances, there's a better trajectory there maybe of abuse or addiction or frequent use, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Or is it like 21, you know what I mean?
No, yeah, thank you for the question. There was a large-scale study done in the U.S. on alcoholism from the National Institute of Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse, and they found that people who drank before the age of 15, about 40% of them reported later alcohol addiction. When they surveyed people who drank at the age 17, they had about a 25% rate of reporting addiction. And then surveying people at age 21, they later, it was like 10% of them reported addiction. So it goes down incrementally. Correct, yeah, giving your brain more time to develop.
I also just had a comment, I'm a school counselor here at Collegiate, so I was in your faculty presentation earlier, I'm a lower school counselor.
Oh,
But
great.
some of your resources that you mentioned, like Common Sense Media and Child Mind Institute, I use those all the time for different lessons, and those are like really good parent resources that I just back you on.
Oh, awesome.
With like the little lower school, younger lower school kids, I use those.
Yeah, they have them divided by ages. It's super helpful developmentally. And you were mentioning Operation Parent, is it?
You were asking about media and like Netflix, and I did a webinar. They have webinars and they record them. And it was about Netflix, drugs, nicotine, and just like it had a lot of data and tools for how much influence that has on our teens and usage. And I'm the upper school counselor. We've had lots of conversations in my character classes just about how media influences, and we've talked a little bit about Euphoria and what's it like for a ninth grader to watch Euphoria versus someone who's maybe a senior who's gone through high school and knows that that isn't a portrayal of what high school really is. So we're having those conversations and the kids get it, but it's still hard not to watch.
Mm-hmm.
I was gonna add, Operation Parent is a local website in town, and if you just sign up kind of on their website, all of their stuff is free, and like Julian said, they tape a lot of things and push out webinars so you can watch it at your convenience and really good stuff.
Awesome. Thank y'all for sharing that. Yeah.
And I separate, maybe wrongly so, alcohol out of the mix with substance abuse, drugs, and nicotine with my comment. Is there a place for promoting responsible use? Not that there's always a place for that, but, and caveat in which the expectation is you wouldn't do it, but it's hard not to then ignore the fact that they are more likely to do it. Therefore, how do you introduce responsible use without giving them the green light that the expectation is it's okay to use?
Thank you. That's a great question. And you're talking specifically about alcohol? Right.
In my head, it's never okay to use nicotine and it's never okay to use drugs, and that may be naive, but when I look at alcohol, probably because of how socially accepted it is in this country, to me, by ignoring responsible use, I'm not sure that's right, but by accounting for responsible use, are you giving them the green light to use?
That's a great question. So thinking about alcohol, certainly, absolutely, there is space for education about what is higher risk use and what is lower risk use. I think potentially, like, I hear what you're saying, like, there could be a mixed message there. It's like, hey, listen, this is not my expectation of you, but these are lower risk and higher risk ways to do this. I think students having or children having both sets of information is important. I will say we've had discussions about lower risk alcohol use this week, simply from students saying, well, I'm allowed to do this, so I'm already doing it. And they do equally need to know, like, how do you cope ahead? How do you plan for this? And what is one serving of alcohol for different substances? And how do you pay attention to the ABV on the product, alcohol by volume percentage? So those are some discussions that we have been having, and I think would be very healthy to have at home as well. And again, you can just bookend it with your expectations. Yeah.
There's a really interesting course on EverFi. If anyone wants to email me, I can send it to you. It's called like, do you know EverFi? It's like alcohol,
don't.
EDU, and there's one for high school students and one for college students. But I mean, the message is the same, like delay use, but it does also bring you through like what are the amounts and what's like a dangerous use of alcohol in school, and also like what the legal implications are of like driving or families having underage drinkers at their house. I thought it was really, I took it just to see what it was like, and I thought it was pretty informative and like a good baseline. I think it's for all in school, like 9 through 12. I thought it was pretty good.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that resource. Two, just in the way of those, you can go to fcd.org and sign up for newsletters where we send them out every quarter or so on specialty topics, like how to talk to students who are transitioning to college about alcohol or other drugs and things like that. So that's another place, not to flood anyone's inbox, but I know. Yes, please.
As you're working with the student population here, are you pretty much seeing the same types of statistics and things that you are showing us? Are you seeing like areas where we're kind of doing better as a community, or maybe things that we need to be like more alert about as a community?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think there certainly is a exaggerated perception of use here. That is something I see, and it's not an outlier. I see that in many communities I go to. So there is space there, room for continued social norms education. Even I worked with seniors talking about social norms in college, the data we have there, and even in that space where more people are using it, it might not be as many as you think, and they might not be using in higher risk ways. There is certainly lots of conversation around marijuana and e-cigarettes as well. I wouldn't say that there have been like other extremely concerning things have come out, like these products I showed and mentioned. I haven't heard specific discussion of, except for Puff Bar. That's one that we have talked about. Protections-wise, again, I've seen so much warmness between faculty and students that I don't see everywhere. So that is a sign that there are adult mentors here. That's very protective. In terms of parents permitting substance use, I would say that is similar to what I see other places. Some parents do, some other students' parents do not, and whether they're disclosing or not, the fact that they feel open enough to talk about it with me, I also don't get everywhere. So I think that speaks to maybe the trust they have in the community here. So that's just a little bit. Other protections, these students are very busy, which can be a protection, can also be a risk factor if they have chronic stress that's unresolved. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to ask you a question that was posted online.
Oh, yes, sure.
Somebody had asked, is there a correlation, and I think I'm understanding this, between substance use and allowance or discretionary funds that kids have access to?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Is there a correlation between substance use and their like monetary allowance or discretionary funds that they have access to?
Really good question. I don't have specific research about allowance, but what we do see in research is that private school students who, not all of them certainly, but statistically have higher socioeconomic status, access to resources, when they're in middle school, have lower rates of use than public school students. And then in high school, that flips. They have higher rates of use than public school students. And one of the proposed reasons for that is access to resources, expendable funds. So, yeah. But yes, so student stress can potentially play, into their decisions to cope with substances, but that is in the absence of other healthy coping mechanisms, which I've also seen here students who are like, we love sports. I said, is it sports more of a stressor, more of a reliever? It was something they enjoyed, something that they felt empowered by and likely build many, many social and coping skills through. So thank you for asking that. Any other questions or thoughts or anything from online world? Okay. All right. Well, yes, absolutely, not to take any more time. Thank you all so much again for being here. I will be around today and tomorrow if you need anything or if you need support in the future. We're here year-round for you all, so please ask the counselor if you need information for us. We can get that to you. All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Emily's interested in all the research that she was all about.
Thank you. This was so good. And I have a, so I work here, and I have a daughter in the high school that's a sophomore, and she's met you and talked to you, and she's like, it's great. I'm learning a lot of things. So,
That's great.
You're very easy to connect with. So, and all this research is so good. I just feel like even as a counselor, it's like I need frequent refreshers because it changes so quickly. And
Oh, me too. I'm still like, and all the resources mentioned, I like take note. It's just
I mean, you must just be constantly looking at research. I feel like just hearing you go to all these conferences, like the tobacco conference, the youth conference, and the
yes, everyone's always sharing too, which I'm sure you all are too. So,
very good. Thank you. Get some really good tips.
oh, good. I'm glad. Thank you for being here tonight. Appreciate that.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Oh, of course. You're very
You here for
welcome.
one more day?
Yes, tomorrow. Thank you for being here
Do you
tonight.
have any insights or anything I should know as head of school? Just let me know. I'll probably cross paths with you.
Yes, and I know we're having an upper school leadership team meeting tomorrow.
Good,
I'll
good.
hear back from them.
Great,
Yes.
great. Julian and Sarah will let me know.
Yes, of course.
Thank you so much. Really
Absolutely,
appreciate it.
yes.
Julian, thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, you're the best. Come on.
One question before I was going to be
Choir, thank you.
perception of our students.